Welcome to Corporate Cafecito, a podcast based on professional development, career growth, and respecting our cultural identity.
Welcome back to Corporate Cafecito. I'm Carlos Butler Vale.
And yo soy Nayeli Suarez Gas. And today we're going to talk about a topic that's going to feel like, what are you talking about? But we're going to talk about growth because ultimately that's our goal at Corporate Cafecito, is to give you the tools and advice to help you grow. But sometimes that growth feels like a loss. And to explain it, it's kind of, it's interesting because probably the first time we feel that is high school graduation, where, we are going on different paths, leaving our friends, sometimes leaving our family. And so in this goal to grow and to learn or to expand our environment, we feel like we lose a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's one of those things where as you're going through it, you can't always necessarily see what's on the other end of it. But it's one of those things that's absolutely critical and necessary. And I think you're right to point out the fact that this is a cyclical thing. This is a process that happens throughout multiple points in our lives, and it doesn't stop once you get into a corporate environment. It just probably looks a little different.
Well, it's very interesting. I remember once I got promoted, I used to work in like a telemarketing area. We made appointments for blood donations, and I got promoted to the lab. And I felt so left out from that community that I had, because we would have potlucks. We would all sit around together, like, when things were slow. And it just felt like, oh man, I left that behind, or that part of me, I can't participate in the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, I think, particularly tough when you're in environments where you've made really great connections with people who are your peers, and then all of a sudden sometimes it ends up being that now you're the boss, and that can really completely change the dynamic. And there's a whole series of lessons that go along with that, I think, as well. And I'm sure you know probably more than most about what that kind of entails. I think about, to the point about going from that process of being one of the folks to being in that sort of leadership role. Mm-hmm. It is, and you hear people say sometimes that leadership can be lonely, and that leadership and supervisory roles can be tough, because you do have to make, in each step of the rung, you have to create a different level of separation.
Right.
But it's one of those growth things that is just so critical, and that's where I think authenticity really comes into play, and it makes a tremendous sense of importance, because people will know no matter what, that even if you're having to go through something like that, they can still rely on you being you. But I'm curious to hear a little bit more about, because you started talking about how this starts, or it feels like sometimes we really get to understand that, from high school, and then there's that, what I call, divergence of paths. But tell us a little bit more about maybe an example or something along those lines.
Oh, I will tell you, probably the time I felt it the most was 6 years ago, when I left corporate and I started Elevar and my trucking company. First of all, we just had the 6-year anniversary for Elevar.
Congratulations. That's awesome.
But I was leaving like everything I knew, which was the corporate environment, which was having benefits, having a routine, having a schedule full of meetings, having PTO. And so I think a lot of people, when they're in that kind of environment, it seems very like cool to jump out and start something on your own. And then when you do it, you're just like, oh my God, this feels so sad. Now I have to hunt for all my clients. I have to, build my processes, write my contracts, do all these things. And there's no one to help you. And I think the term is solopreneur for people who are out there, and you are both the company and the product.
Absolutely.
So, that one to me was probably where I felt like the biggest loss, because not only did I lose my connection with my coworkers, I lost my coworkers. I lost my support teams. To be honest, I felt like I even lost the sense of who I was because I had so been a corporate persona, right?
Yeah.
I would jump in and I would lead the Latin groups, I would lead the women's groups, I would, be speaker at events for these companies. And
Yeah.
then I'm like, oh, that went away.
Yeah.
And it took a little bit. I still go to therapy. I go to therapy every week, but it took a lot to help process like that grieving in that morning of like who I was and who I was going to become, because in my head I was like, this is who I want to be.
Yeah.
And to grow, I had to process that loss.
Yeah. As you're saying that, I think the thing that comes to mind for me is when you're one of the peeps,
Hmm.
it feels sometimes easy to blend in, even if you're somebody who stands out. And as you grow in your career, you're having to do more of those things where the visibility increases.
Yeah.
And suddenly the repartee may not necessarily be the same because it can't be the same.
Right.
And that's how you connected and engaged with people.
Yeah. Those are my
And
friends. Like we
absolutely,
showed up every
yeah,
day.
yeah. And then this notion of, I think it's a little less, it feels like it's a little less prominent now, but first in, last out, that becomes real for you as you're continuing to grow in your career. And I think the biggest thing for me where I felt like I experienced that sense of grievance and loss was that everything you were doing was being watched and dissected and interpreted.
Mhm.
And there's a sense of freedom that you lose a little bit in that makes it really difficult for someone who is going through that process for the first time, especially if you don't have people to talk to,
Yeah.
or you don't have maybe a coach or something along those lines to help you through that process. So,
Yeah, it's really hard. I also think because you brought up the first time managers,
mm-hmm.
um, when you become a first time manager, you need to befriend all the other first time managers and the people who are existing managers, because they're going to teach you the ropes.
Yeah.
And I was working with this cohort, and they were all first time managers. They had all been promoted from equal positions, and now they were in this cohort.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, okay, look around you. This is your team.
Yeah.
This is your team.
They're your
When you have a
crew.
problem, you talk to someone else in this group.
Yeah.
When you have something happy, you talk about it with this group. Like, this is now who your team is. And I think that one of the things that we take for granted is when we make those connections, they stay with us forever.
They
Like,
do.
I was texting with my boss from 20 years
Wow.
ago the other day, because he had previously lived in California, and I said, "Do you still have your house there?
Mm-hmm.
Is everything okay?" And he's like, "Oh no, we sold the house." But that was the kind of connections that we had, where if I see something, I'm still gonna call you and make sure
Yeah.
you're okay. Um, and when you make those connections, we all grow up together.
Yeah.
So that growth, is also going to be amongst your peer group. So if you're a first time manager, chances are one day you may become a director.
Mm-hmm.
And the people around you are also going to become the directors.
Yeah.
And so if you're in a group that encourages growth, that motivates others, that tells people like you could dream bigger, dream higher, reach, for everything, then you'll see that group with that mindset collectively grow.
That's amazing. And you now brought up a totally
Yeah, I'm
different
like, I know you've
element of
seen
that
that.
for
Yeah.
me too, which is sometimes part of that process is also realizing that you may be growing at a different rate than others,
Yeah.
and vice versa. And that is part of that pain in the growth too, because you sort of realize it. You brought up high school graduation. That is a pivotal point where everybody sort of starts off at the same kind of level. But as you continue to grow and progress in your career, for a number of reasons, any number of reasons, things could be,
Yeah.
it could change. Maybe someone gets promoted a little faster. Maybe someone moves to a different department. Maybe someone has to move to a different state. There could be any number of things, right? But sometimes for me, part of that growth had to be to keep my head down, focus on myself, and continue
And
to
cheer
do
them
the work
on.
and also cheer them on,
Yeah.
because not everyone's necessarily on a parallel path. When you're watching that, sometimes it can feel painful, especially if you
Yeah.
don't know everything that's kind of
Sometimes someone
happening.
else's growth is your loss.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's exactly right. And so I want to ask you, because I think, again, I joke, I said it probably
Mhm.
jokingly, but I mean it. You know, you're probably better positioned, I think, than most folks I know to be able to say, hey, what are some things that people can do as they're experiencing these kinds of things? For me as a Latino, I think I look at it a number of ways. I look at it as how are my peers doing, and then how are other folks that maybe are sometimes failing up, maybe sometimes, and that can be frustrating too, right? But what are some key things that people can do as they're sort of experiencing this growth that sometimes may feel a little painful or may feel like a little bit of loss?
You know what? I always say take like take inventory of where you are at this moment and where you're
Mm-hmm.
feeling and write it down because nothing is forever,
Yeah.
right? You're gonna feel doubt or you may feel lost or you may miss or you may cry or you may feel dumb or you may feel inept as you're taking on more responsibilities and doing more things. And I love to think of like how you felt day one,
Mm.
right? And I'm a big journaler. um I actually have this book, and it's called one line at a time, and it's you put the year, so it has all the days, and you
Okay.
put the year, and you just write like one thought for that day.
Wow.
And
Okay.
so it has five 5 years, I think. So you could look back like when you're writing in that and you could look back and you're like, wow, like 2 years ago, like today was a really rough day.
Yeah.
And 2 years later, I don't even remember it. And so I think it's understanding that we experience loss, you're gonna experience it again, but also like you have to aim higher or
Yeah.
you have to keep growing. But I wanna make a caveat that growth doesn't have to be promotions or
Yeah.
raises or anything. Like,
Absolutely.
you know, um, I admire my friends who have taken time off to be home with their children,
Yeah.
right? And that is a different kind of growth. And that is a priority of family growth.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I couldn't do that. We didn't have the money for me to stay home, but I admire the people who can,
Sure.
and I think that's a personal choice too. And I think a lot of times, specifically women, right? If we take that time off to stay home, have the child, and then go back to work, we come in feeling behind.
Mm-hmm.
And but it's like, okay, at that time, take inventory to be like, but why did I take this time off?
Yeah.
And what growth am I having here? I grew my family. Or, if we take time off because we were sick or taking care of our parents, like then it's a different. So I think sometimes we think of growth, especially like if someone else gets promoted and we're like, we started here the same time. It's like, okay, but we had different priorities,
Yeah.
or maybe I should have taken on more, or maybe I was very comfortable with where I am. Women, especially once we hit a certain age, we'll start feeling that growth is out of our reach.
Mm.
And it's really sad. Women
That
get
is.
exited out of corporate America in their 50s,
Wow.
right? We see a reduction in force, and it's going to be some of my friends will be exited.
Yeah.
And so there's that loss there of like identity,
Absolutely.
and there's a sense of failure.
Yeah.
um, Instead of staying stuck there, it's important to understand like how much did I grow to get there, and what was my trajectory. And I think
The
looking,
sacrifices.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I
Without a
think
doubt.
looking back, you could see all the growth you've had.
Yeah.
But if you're looking at it just from one day, you're never going to see it.
Yeah, I think that's such a really important point, because growth, I haven't experienced growth to be linear for me
Mm-mm.
ever. I mean, even if you look, and I'm not talking just from a work perspective. I'm not talking about professionally. Even personally, the growth trajectory has
Mm-hmm.
been very non-linear. And so, in our case, we Brian and I have talked about, what happens if one of us ends up having to stay at home or chooses to stay at home. So we don't have those, I would say, traditional gender roles, but I think the feeling also is sort of mutual, which is like, what is the loss potentially of having to leave something behind and then feeling like you're wanting to pursue something that is really critical and important, but it may force you to, as you said, when you're back, it feels like you're
Like you're
having to
even
defend,
behind.
yeah, and you're having
Yeah.
to defend, and things move at such a rapid pace that, yeah, I can totally understand that. But I think one of the things that, so I mentioned, I think before in one of our previous episodes, that I have a nephew who's 20, and it was so interesting for me. He's one of my mentees. I absolutely love him, adore him. He's my little protege, and I remember thinking back to when I was around 20. I feel like I call it my mid quarter life crisis, around 25, 30 or so. I was really depressed because
Mhm.
I realized there was this moment of realization where I had an idea in my head of what I thought growth should be, and it felt like something I can plot, and it felt like something I can just go from step 1 to step 2, from point A to point B. And here I am having a conversation with my nephew who's 20, who's frustrated at the fact that his growth doesn't feel as linear as he thought it would be. And it was both a lesson for me to think back to your point, reflect back to who I was as a person at that moment,
Yeah.
but also I wish I would have heard when I was 20 someone tell me that it's okay because growth isn't linear. And
No, it's like,
yeah,
yeah.
and what I appreciate the most is he's one of the people that really looks up to me and has no idea or sense of understanding of what has happened to get to that the level of growth of where I'm at today. So it was this amazing moment where he was able to now finally understand that you can still achieve success depending on how you define it, and it doesn't have to go exactly according to plans.
Right. Right. And also, I think that it's important when you do see someone's growth being linear, understanding that they're on a different path.
That, yeah, love
Yeah.
that. Yeah,
And it may look linear to us, and they may have had a completely different version or vision of what their career was going to be like.
absolutely. And again, for the audience, it's important to keep in mind that even though this is Corporate Cafecito, it's important for us to remember that much of who we are at work is obviously the people that we are, period, right? That's
Yeah.
why folks say bring your whole self to work. And so this, yes, it's sometimes more tangible to talk about these things from a career perspective, but it's hard to achieve career growth if you're not also achieving or striving for some sense of personal growth.
I agree. Just in summary, to give some tips as you are growing and feeling this sense of loss, like if you feel like you're going to lose connection, or you're going to lose time with your family, or you're going to just lose like the sense of understanding how to do your job really well, and now you're going to go into this new role and you're going to feel a little stupid when you start, make a, journal,
Mm-hmm.
write down how you feel, because you're not going to feel that for long. And that way you could go back and be like, oh, you know what? I did this and I felt like this, but I don't feel like that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is keep the connections you want to keep. If you leave a place or you get promoted and you're going to lose your team, etc., stay close to the people you want to
Right.
stay close
Doesn't
with.
have to end.
Right.
Yeah.
And then 3 is write your growth plan, and put in there what you're going to lose with each one. Because I think it's really important to understand like what you want to do and understand the sacrifices, right? Like, what do I have to give up? Well, I may have to travel more, or I may not have the flexibility of working from home.
Mm-hmm.
And be okay with that if you want that path. And then if you think that that loss is going to be too much of a loss, then maybe it's not for you.
Yeah, I would plus one all of that. And I would
Mhm.
say, just to even take it a step further, as you're journaling, think clearly about where you might, what that gap might be that you might be feeling or
Mhm.
sensing, because as time moves on, it's easier to either understand if there is something real there, or if there was just momentary perception, or whether or not, there's a need to maybe reframe
Mhm.
things. And then one thing that I think is really important, or that I have found to be important, is think about milestones. Right, you
Yeah.
talked about your growth path, and I think, to me, that can often feel like very specific things. Like, I want to be,
I want to be VP by 32. You're like,
yeah, I
slow
want to
down.
have, $1 million in the bank by so on and so forth. And, life happens,
Yeah.
right? But what are milestones?
Hmm.
So, what does that mean? What does it mean to
I
be
love that.
VP by
Yeah.
X? What does it mean to have X amount of
So,
money in the bank by
I went
X?
from a VP position to an executive director position. And I remember someone said, like, "Ooh, doesn't that title change bother you?" And I'm like, the money doesn't,
Yeah.
like, I don't care what you call me. Call me an analyst. As
Yeah.
long as my salary keeps going up,
Yeah.
I am okay. And so, I realized that title didn't mean anything to me. Like,
But the financial
the
security that
financial
came
that
from the
came, yeah,
salary. Yeah.
exactly. And so for some people, it's going to be the title.
Yeah.
For some people, it's going to be a certain mile marker income,
Yeah.
and so I think that's a really good idea.
Yeah. And it could be, I want to be working somewhere warm.
Yeah.
And again, define sort of what that means. And it may seem silly, but all these things kind of
Yeah.
add up. And I think maybe sometimes to a fault, probably, but I live in this very real space between, it's a challenge between being a realist but also being a pragmatist. And so I often tend to look at things in a very positive light. Um, and so for me, I like to, even when I'm experiencing growth and I'm experiencing pain, I like to think about what are the positives that come from that. And
Yeah.
so I would say it's not something
But
that I
did you
learned
die?
overnight.
Right.
Yeah, it's not something that I learned overnight, but for anyone that's going through this and they're going through that reflection process, think about what are the gains.
Yeah.
Because in almost every situation that I've had, whether it's been personal or professional, even if it's felt painful or that there's been a sense of loss, there's always been a gain.
Yeah. Awesome. Wow. I think that's some good advice for you to consider as you grow and continue on your professional path. We'll be here with more topics to cheer you on and for you to lean on. So, with that, we say salud,
Salud.
and we'll see you next time on Corporate Cafecito.
See you soon.